You know, it's really a nice looking Jeep, but somehow it just doesn't cut it. You know, it could be so much more with just a little bit of work. Now I get it, your wife has to be able to get in it. Maybe you haven't got a budget to put a full suspension system on it right now. But for under 500 bucks, we can change this rental boy into a JK that looks and performs like a Jeep. Now that we've got the vehicle up in the air, we're going to throw some jack stands under it just to support that axle. That way when we take these track bar bolts out, it won't have any bind on it. Now you can pull those bolts out on the ground and have the same effect, or you can do it up in the air and just take some pressure off it with the jacks. After we've done that, we're going to go around and loosen every one of those control arm bolts, upper and lower. That'll let that axle have some good swing to it. Now we're going to go through and remove anything that'll hinder that axle from dropping, the brake line and the shock. With the shock removed, we can now lower the axle down far enough to give us enough clearance to get that spring out. Let's start with the rear track bar bracket. This bracket is used to center the axle under the Jeep. Page 15 of the instructions provides you with a template for that rear track bar bracket. Just cut it out, lay it up against the original track bar. You can even put the bolt through it to help center it. Now Ben actually cut that hole out. That's not really necessary if you don't want to. You can use the crosshairs in it to give you a good spot to center punch. Use a 3/8 drill bit and drill a hole through the original track bar bracket. Now we're ready to install the new drop bracket using a 14mm bolt, the washer and nut provided. There's also a sleeve that came in the kit. That sleeve is used to prevent that bracket from crushing when we tighten it up. Let's grab the rear spacers and get ready to put those on. The first thing we're going to do is remove the factory isolator from up in the top of the spring bucket. We're going to use that isolator and push it on to our TeraFlex spacer. Once we've got that isolator in place, we can take a little bit of grease and just apply it to the top of that new spacer. It'll really help in install. Now a real man can just push these up in there and snap them into place. I've never been able to do that. I always use a 4x4, a block of wood or whatever, and just put it between that spacer and the frame and push it up into place. You should feel or hear a pop as that spacer snaps into position. We're going to need to lower the axle even more to get that spring back in because we have added a 2-inch spacer at the top. The last thing that's hindering our down travel is that sway bar link. So let's go ahead and get that out of the way. We're going to need to save that sway bar link and use it up on the front. We're going to replace it with our new one on the rear. Make sure that you've got all those ABS lines popped loose. Make sure nothing will hinder the down travel. Continue to lower the axle until you've got plenty of clearance to reinstall that factory spring. Next up is the rear lower bump stops. They're pretty easy to install. We're just going to use the existing holes in the pad, and we're going to put that extended portion of that bump stop facing the front of the Jeep. Before you tighten either one of the bolts, make sure that you start both of the nuts. Once you've got the nuts started, use a 1/2-inch end wrench and tighten them up. Now on our rear shock extensions, there's a left and a right, so we need to make sure we're putting the correct one onto the correct side. First thing we'll need to do is to finish taking that rear shock right off. So we'll loosen the two upper bolts, and we'll just go ahead and set that shock anywhere for now. With that out of the way, we can go ahead and put our bracket up into place. Now there's 3 bolts. There's 2 long ones and a short one. Just put the short one in there, get it started, and then we can go ahead and install the longer bolt into one side. With that in place, we can slide the shock bar pin into position And with it in one side, we can put the last bolt in, and it'll hold that shock up into place. With all 3 bolts started and in position, we can go ahead and tighten them up. We're going to use 37 foot-pounds on the upper bolts and 56 foot-pounds on that lower bolt. We've already got our brake line loose from the frame, so let's go ahead and put our brake line extension brackets on. This bracket will index and bolt right up to the existing bracket that came on your brake line, a 10mm bolt. So go ahead and reinstall the factory bolt into that upper part of our bracket and secure it to the frame. The last component we have to install is that rear sway bar link. Now remember, these are the new sway bar links that came with the kit. We're going to use our existing ones and put those up on the front. We'll have to install the grease zerks. Just tighten them up with a 5/16. Make sure you put it on so that you can have access to those grease fittings when it comes time to grease it. So you'll have those facing the rear. We're going to install the link on the inside of the bracket. Now the lower bolt, we're going to use the factory bolt that was with the original kit. You remember on the front there was a stud, so we had to replace it with a new bolt on the top. We're going to install that bolt facing the inside. We have the head of the bolt to the outside so that it won't rub on the tire. Go ahead and torque those up and we're ready to go. Next thing we'll do is just raise the axle back up to meet that shock and put that lower bolt back in it. We've already got the top bolts all tightened up and in place with our spacers. We've got everything installed on the rear and it's all tightened up, except we do not want to tighten up those control arms or the track bar. We want to tighten those up as soon as we get it on the ground. That way we won't bind the bushings. Let's start with the front install. We've already got our track bar bolt out, and we've already loosened our control arm bolts, both at the axle and at the frame side, upper and lower. So we can go ahead and start removing anything that will hinder the down travel of that axle. Things like our breather tube, even our ABS lines, the shocks, the sway bar links, anything that'll stop it from coming down. We'll loosen all those up. Now we can get enough travel to pull the spring out, and we'll go ahead and install the spacer. Same as we did on the rear, we'll apply a little grease on there to help with install. Go ahead and pull out the existing factory bump stop, as well as that upper spring isolator. With our factory isolator and our bump stop out of the way, we're ready to put in the new spacer. Watch out, you might get grease on you. And then we're ready to put the factory isolator back into place. We can go ahead and grab our bump stop extension. Apply a little grease on there. Pushing in the bump stop adapter is a little more work. Some people can push them in by hand, but very few. Ben just uses the axle as a press and pushes that bump stop into position. With our new spacer, the factory isolator, our bump stop extension, and the factory bump stop all put back into position, we're ready to install the spring. Lower the axle so you've got plenty of room to slide that spring up there. Again, we have an additional 2 inches at the top, so you may have to drop that axle just a little more. We're now ready to put on our upper shock extension. We've already got the lower bolt out of the way, so all we need to do is undo that upper nut. Now if the shock spins on you, they cleverly supplied us with a little spot where you can slide an end wrench on there to hold that shock from spinning while you undo that upper bolt. The shock extension simply screws onto the existing shock stud. and then replace the shock bushings. Ben assembled the shock just to show us what it's going to look like when it's into its final resting place. We're going to have a washer, a bushing, then the frame's going to go in between the two bushings. Then we'll have a nut and washer at the top. So before he installs it, we'll go ahead and take that nut, the washer, and bushing off the top of it and just leave the lower washer and bushing on, slide it up into position, add that upper bushing and washer and nut back on it, and that shock's in place. As we tighten the upper mound up, there's a torque spec of 20 pounds. But really, if you just watch it, you can see that bushing just start to crush and you're good. And we still have the option of holding that shock from turning with a 5/8 end wrench if we need to. On the lower bolt, we're going to use 56 foot-pounds to tighten it up. We're now ready to finish removing that front sway bar link. Now remember, we saved that rear sway bar link because it's a little bit longer. We're going to put it up onto the front. It'll mount the same way the original one did. When we install that front sway bar link, it's a little tricky. We want to put the links on the outside of the sway bar end and on the inside of the axle mount. Now that we've got everything in place, we're ready to lower the Jeep down and go ahead and tighten up all of our control arms and our track bars. There's really no adjustment necessary with this kit. Worst case is you'll need to straighten the steering wheel. That's easily done by using the adjusting sleeve on the drag link. Just loosen it up, straighten the wheel, tighten it back up, and you're good to go. Adding this kit has dramatically altered Rental Boy's status. Now it really looks and performs